Hi guys, it's time for the part 3 of this daily looking at CatZ's little strategy. And we've started to see this, like the end of the story arc of how does one come up with as weird an idea as Swarm Host Nydus network plus infestor play. And what we're seeing out of CatZ is that he's got the chance to refine it over time as an example of how you should totally go for refining and testing out your build over time. We've got the chance to see in part 1, looking at very standard play, seeing if standard play was the best way to do this. It didn't seem to work. Then we saw going for queens and rushing for the Nydus network play, and that didn't seem to work. And then we finally, at the start of part 2, saw not rushing for anything, just focusing more on the queens, more on the economy, and eventually getting the layer tech up. Wound up being very, very, very nice for us. We still had all our defense up early for all the various pieces of what the enemy could be doing. And that's when it's time to really explore what the strengths and weaknesses of the style are. It will always take a couple games to get used to it. We saw in the last game in part 2, the game that just happened on Newkirk City, that CatZ got into this really weird situation when this guy literally spotted every single frickin' Nydus network frickin' ever, and CatZ could not do any early aggression and was kind of left in this spot. And those spots are very useful always because they help reveal where there are spaces to fill in the strategy. And an expand is an excellent tool in a future game to fill in that. Droning a little harder, getting additional defensive structures, an excellent thing to fill into that gap. And I think most importantly in that last game, two things were seen. One, there were multiple opportunities where CatZ could have done multi-pronged attacks, especially with the burrowed infestors, and they would have been really, really effective. So that means that there's a lot more potential for this attack than just a single prong of engagement where the Nydus network is. You can split off a couple of infestors as you're pushing with Swarm Host. And the other, and I think most important thing, is that we saw that early Ling Baneling bust occur, and then CatZ was still in a fine position, objectively speaking. He lost 16 workers and was still okay. Really cool. In this game, we're going to see another totally, epically heinous situation, seemingly, where I will say objectively CatZ is totally behind, but we still can see more strengths of this play, just as another fun last game to see an example of this strategy in action. Ah, yes, very, very tasty. So, we now have CatZ going for, excuse me, for this hatch first opening. This is one of these games that will be one of these defining type games for a player. Or, excuse me, it will be a defining type game for a strategy. Our hatch just finished. The enemy's hatch halfway finished. What does that mean? Our enemy either sucks or went pool first. So, okay, we're up against a pool firster. Very important time is that generally speed is done by 6 minutes. Almost always. There's 120 seconds, 4-minute mark. Generally 6 minutes is about as early as that Zergling speed can surprise you. I like to back off from that and say 5:30, 5:45, in case he's going for something a little bit more Startail lifelike. But yeah, pretty standard stuff, just getting the 2 queens up. Notice, absolutely no Zerglings out of CatZ. But he sees these 4 coming up, very standard, typical type of stuff. Rather than wait until after the 5-minute mark to start the spine crawler, we may as well get that bad boy started now, considering we're really going to be up against Baneling and Zergling aggression potentially at like 5:30, 5:45. This is one of these hilarious and painful moments that make you realize how important just having 2 Zerglings would have been. CatZ is forced to do a cancel there. What would our adjustment be in a future game? In my eyes, it would be just build 2 Zerglings, and if you see some more Zerglings streaming on down early on, then you just need to make sure you keep your first spine crawler alive with these 2 Zerglings. But either way, CatZ is still going for his 4 queen type play. And now has to build himself up a lot of damn spine crawlers. No spine crawler is done. The placement is problematic. The ramp's kind of far away. Everything's icky. We end up in this gross spot. CatZ even goes ahead and builds backup spine crawlers in his main base. So this is what would be very clearly defined as a bad start to the game, right? This is like the, oh god, how do we adjust out of this one? Now, CatZ, fortunately, is in a pretty, or CatZ, after that, the death of that hatch, can kind of demonstrate that, well, 4 queens are pretty close to being able to hold this off. Not guaranteed, but pretty close. What would the adjustment be in a future game? Something like building the spine crawler up farther, up to this north side, so that way drones can sort of merge between it, can cover up on the ramp. Doing something like even building an Evo chamber here and having there be some subtle SimCity. It's very difficult on this sort of map. I might even say, wow, we really do need to build an initial 4 to 12 Zergling to deal with this, because these starting queens aren't enough. But what I wouldn't do to adjust out of this position, what I wouldn't do is try to do something like go for banelings, trying to go for roaches. These would all be last resorts because I want to do as far a deviation away from this queen drone emphasis, because as we've seen in all of part 2 and the end of part 1, if you can get past that opening stage, which is right now, and you can get to that Nydus network swarm host situation, you're in amazing shape. You're in amazing shape. And in fact, watch this baller recovery as I speed it up a little bit. CatZ, who just built up spines, gas, re-expanded. Enemy still breaks in, does a little bit of damage, wanders around, tries to get some banelings up. Even while all this is going on, look at this. Over in the enemy base, Cold Front is expanding. He has his layer done. I think his spire's done as well. Nope, there's his spire started. CatZ is behind on the drone count by a lot. He's behind on the gas count. Everything that could count against him is counting against him. And yet... still. He's going to go ahead and begin getting these swarm hosts up. He's getting this upgraded as evolution chamber for the swarm hosts. Completely skipped out on infestors.
The hive cluster is under attack.
Starts to flood with the spore crawlers as he's leaving out of the base, which is excellent. So now we have a 2-base Zerg going up against a very strong 3-base, about to be 4-base Zerg. And here's the Nydus network at a nice frontally placed position where there's not really going to be any incidental mutilisking moving around. And behold the power of Swarm Host Queen in the mid-game. Rather than focus on a build order or on timings that we talked a little bit about in part 2, this is a useful look at the broad concepts that end up sort of emerging from looking at the Swarm Host Queen in use. Because obviously we don't want to use build orders and timings anymore because we already lost our first hatch and kind of had to wing it from there. But broadly speaking, you don't need that much injecting to be spending all your money. Because you're spending money on the queens, the swarm hosts cost quite a lot of money and gas. The infestors cost a good bit of money and gas. So as long as this queen hatches, builds larvae, and then just heads straight to the battlefield, you actually end up fine on the economy. Even if this does not end up working with the first Nydus, that's totally not a problem. The creep is as critical a component to this build as all the units are, because the queens are just unable to do much of anything against a Mutalisking player. Especially with the Spore Crawlers there, it's going to be really hard for the Mutalist to do anything. But what's super rad to me is that we actually get to see with this almost doubling supply count from Cold Front and multiple attempts to do counterattacks up in the main base. This game winds up being ridiculously freaking close. The Infestors, I think, are not as useful in a counterattack situation unless they can really get deep into the main in a spot like this, but this expansion becomes vulnerable because the pressure we're putting on at the front. This expansion becomes vulnerable because of the pressure we're putting on at the front. But doing counterattacks up here, he can just run roaches right through the Locust Fire and kill off the infested Terrans. I'm questioning whether the incorporation of a handful of Mutalisks would be useful to go down here to kill these expansions off, but I actually don't have any solid answer to that. That's literally just a thought right now. The goal, though, for CatZ is to just continue to get more creep spread up towards this base. It's a super gradual type process to do these like big broad pushes. In the other games we saw smaller numbers of queens and swarm hosts able to do some pretty nice damaging type stuff, but once there is enough units to be able to run to multiple locations, the goal becomes huge pushing, not multiple front pushing, like we were seeing in that excellent game from Part 1. And with just one or two fungals, that's all it takes to be wildly effective. I think the incorporation of just like 4 or 5 infestors is all this army really needs to be incredibly potent. Any additional fungal or any additional infestors would be largely used for counterattacks. The main purpose, obviously, of the infestors in this force is that if there's a large ground army that just emerges out of nowhere, we can just fungal growth it just a little bit to keep it in place. And I actually think that CatZ doesn't have the, he doesn't have the enduring locusts or whatever it's called. In fact, in its Lost tab, we're seeing how strong this is against a typical mixture of roaches and mutalisks. And even with the super dedicated shift clicking of Cold Front to try to kill off absolutely everything, locusts are just super powerful.
Mineral field depleted.
So I want to note that this game tragically did not end up going in CatZ's favor, largely because he had lost God, Heart of the Swarm. Always closes all the sounds. Marth spammed me hard. She's on point. Yeah. So yeah, what I like about this sort of game is that it really shows how powerful this strategy is. If you can get mauled that badly, and then begin engaging a player who's doing a real standard style, Mutalisk straight into mass roaches with upgrades, and just be beating him down hard, then wow, this does have a lot of potential. The big question in my eyes is how do we secure additional expansions? Because clearly that is becoming an increasing problem that we've seen consistent throughout the games, but I like that a lot. I'm going to go ahead and take some questions. So, Kadrid says, Day 9, CatZ had a couple games where things got icky, but he kept tweaking his build to make it work. However, when should a player know if their build is simply impossible to exact reliably and make decisions or make a critical change to it? Excuse me. Okay, so to restate the question, because I've taken a long pause, how do you know if... CatZ had been tweaking his build, changing things a lot, adjusting in ways that kind of improve progressively over time. How do we know if our build's bad or whether there's no solution to these sort of problems? The important thing that is to list out all the possible things that he could be doing, and then list the timings that those things are happening at. And along with each of those things, list the timings of the signals. So, for instance, Terran have a lot of really basic ones, like, if at 3:15 I walk to his natural expansion and see a command center, then I know he went one barracks command center. That sort of thing. That's like a standard signal. Or like if you're worried about this Marine Marauder attack that hits you at 6, well, when does it leave the base? It leaves at 5:30. If you send a Zergling up at 4:45, then what would you see if he was trying to do this special sort of Marine Marauder attack? All you have to do is just make sure you're listing out all the possibilities and that you're listing out all the signals. And nothing is also a reasonable signal. So, for instance, saying something like, all right, if he has 5 Marines, then I know then that's a good look for a one-barracksing player. If he has something like 10 Marines, then he's probably gone 2 or more barracks and is getting ready to attack. But if he only has 1 or 2 Marines, I'm getting nothing. I'm getting no information. So he's actually probably going for air if he has that few units. Or if you're up against a player who hasn't expanded, who hasn't tried to attack, who hasn't done anything, you've seen nothing. So he's probably going down some sort of tech path. But you'll wind up in spots that will feel uncomfortable sometimes, like if... what was I going to say? What was I going to say? My brain is having trouble getting it together. Wow, I completely lost my train of thought. Wow. I don't even remember what I was talking about. I super lost my train of thought. That's impressive. Not a lot of people can do that. It's hard to lose your train of thought that badly. Oh yeah, dealing with possible different things that your enemy could be hurling at you. If you're saying something like, wow, at this period, I really need to know if he's attacked. Because if he needs to attack, then I really need to start getting up my defense right away. But if he's not, then I really need to be building 80 freaking drones. When you get to situations like that, where there's clearly only 2 real worries you have anymore, but they're like on completely diametrically opposite sides of the spectrum, that's when it's time to consider doing some shifts in the build order. To start doing a really different strategy. I know that there's a lot of attacking builds that sort of fell into this category, where, you know, if you build a whole bunch of units, and if he was going for an attack, you'd have those units to be able to hold it off. But if he was going for an expand, you could do that, you could use those units and attack him, and that's what would make this okay. But over time, people started to learn that if certain defenses were getting set up, then the attack would fail. So the goal was to figure out early enough if he was going to set up that defense or not. And players couldn't figure it out, so they just stopped attacking altogether. They just said, well, I'm just not going to do this strategy. I'm going to do something else where I'm not building a bunch of early units. I'm going to take 2 more questions because I can feel my brain fizzling out really hard. Yeah. Brickman13, Day 9. Do you like builds like this where the Nydus is such a central piece? I personally feel uncomfortable with builds so delicate because if the Nydus is picked off easily the first time, wouldn't that hugely affect the strat? That's actually what I liked a lot about the game we saw at the end of Part 2. The Nydus network actually got picked off 3 times, and still CatZ was in a reasonable position to do a Nydus network attack. In fact, the 4th Nydus that he put down managed to put some good pressure on the enemy. As long as there is expanding involved with it, I'm totally cool with it. That's what makes strategies not fragile, is that there are always expands behind them. I hate it always when there needs to be something like when you're like doing a drop and you're like, alright, if I don't kill off 12 workers, then I may as well just quit this game. And, well, actually, the main reason I also like the Nydus network is that we don't see it a lot. And it's cool to see CatZ playing around with it in a way that's like totally legit. Let's see here from Shabako, Dearest Day 9. All right, I'm Dearest. What would you feel would enhance CatZ push, and when would one want to initially pull back from this aggressive push? Would any tech patterns want to direct you into a different tech path? I would say that if my opponent had a lot more lings and was low on bases, I would probably not be trying to do anything in the main. Actually, more broadly, I would say, looking at his strategy, the biggest deviation I would do and the biggest change I would be making from game to game is where I put my first Nydus. If he's going for like Infestor Spine at the front, then I'll just like straight up Nydus at the back. Hell, might even double Nydus. Ooh, yeah, doesn't that sound sexy? But I would feel no need to Nydus if he's staying really low on bases. I mean, just reading his situation, realizing, oh, that guy's like really holed up and really defensive. I'd probably just start doing expanding, and even throwing down the Nydus networks at the expansions to be able to do that sort of stuff. In terms of an enhancement, I think CatZ has done a lot of like the legwork, groundwork to create a solid skeleton. I would just start trying to put more expanding emphasis into it, which, I mean, I'm certain CatZ would do now. I mean, that's like always the logical stepping point forward for all dem strategies. I'm just going to do a fist bump to CatZ, who's apparently watching the stream and doing the restream. Thank you, CatZ, for helping to provide the replays. I'm sure many of you have found it extremely difficult to get access to Heart of the Swarm replay stuff, and CatZ kindly provided a lot of games for yesterday, today, and Zerg vs. Protoss games for tomorrow. So thank you, CatZ. Yay! Woo! Follow him on Twitter, ROOTCatZ, and his team Root for Root. Huh? Get it? Yeah, I'm going to go, and I'll see you tomorrow for Zerg vs. Protoss. Friday for FTL, Faster Than Light, and on Monday for Fun Day Monday. Bye, guys!